In American society, money is a taboo topic. We're taught at a young age it's improper to talk about it, but we're also bombarded with messages about the power and importance of money in our everyday lives. And by not talking about it, we miss out on the skills and lessons we need to effectively understand and financially plan. That changes today. Welcome to Money Tales. Hosted by Sandy Brager and Cami Doder, Money Tales brings more than 35 years of combined professional experience in personal finance to demystify money and demonstrate what it's like to speak openly about personal financial matters. Join us each episode as they interview modern-day movers and shakers about how money decisions intertwine with their daily lives in order to give you better insight into productive financial conversations. Subscribe today and register for our blog Fathom at aspiriant.com/podcasts to increase your money mojo. And now, here's Cami and Sandy.
In this episode of Money Tales, we sit down with best-selling author Daniel Pink, who shares the bold decisions that transformed his life and career. At a pivotal moment in his early 30s, Dan made the choice to leave his job as a political speechwriter to pursue his passion for writing. His leap of faith wasn't blind. With his wife's support, careful planning, and a frugal mindset, Dan charted a rational path through uncertainty, balancing existential and financial risks. Let me tell you more about Dan. He's the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, including his latest, The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. His other books include the New York Times bestsellers When and A Whole New Mind, as well as the #1 New York Times bestsellers Drive and To Sell is Human. Dan's books have won multiple awards, have been translated into 46 languages, and have sold millions of copies around the world. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his family.
Here are 3 key money topics Dan hits on in this conversation. First, scarcity and tolerance for risk are distinct but interconnected. While a scarcity mindset can manifest caution and frugality, it doesn't necessarily equate to being risk-averse. In fact, having little to lose can foster a higher tolerance for risk, enabling bold decisions in pursuit of greater opportunities. Second, don't fall for the trap that you must choose between financial security and chasing your dreams. That's a false choice that keeps too many people playing small. And third, Dan's research reveals that there are 2 money regrets that haunt people. One is waiting too long to start building wealth. Think of this as compound interest working against you. The second is not boldly taking your shot at what could be a lucrative opportunity. Now it's our pleasure to bring you Daniel Pink's Money Tales.
Welcome to the Money Tales podcast. I'm Cami Doder.
And I'm Sandy Brager. Cami, I'm so excited that we have Daniel Pink joining us today. And in the spirit of his latest book, The Power of Regret, I'm curious, what is your biggest money regret?
Sandy, there's little ones and there's big ones. So the little ones I think about, there's many of those, but one of my funnier ones was when I bought my Honda Accord a long while ago, and the cost of one with a sunroof and one without, it was a big difference as a percentage. Now I could afford it. It felt extravagant for some reason, and I was a cautious spender. I purchased a car without a sunroof, and I regretted that. I lived in Southern California where sunroofs are not just nice to have, they're really important to give fresh air and whatnot. So that's one. But I'd say on my bigger regrets was not saying, hey, I don't understand this financial concept or idea. Tell me more. There have been many times that I should have, but I felt I should have known. I think Money Tales has really highlighted that a lot of people feel that way. I should know this because I went to business school, so I should know that financial concept. I should know about the stock options I got at Lehman Brothers, but I should have asked more questions.
Were you just sort of nodding politely of, oh yeah, I understand this whenever the conversation was coming up?
Or the conversation didn't come up, or I should have had the conversation. Tell me more about that.
Oh, that's a good one.
What do I do? How do I think about these options when I think about specifically with my job at Lehman Brothers a long time ago? How about you, Sandy?
I've made a lot of good money decisions. I made a lot of bad money decisions. But when the idea of regret comes up, what comes to mind is an event that took place several years back. I was walking in downtown San Francisco. I was out in the open area on the street, and a person came up to me and scammed me for money. And I knew I was being scammed in the moment, and I knew I was being watched, and I just felt uncomfortable and I didn't know what to do. And I handed over $20. So low bar on the dollar side of things, but I just felt so ashamed that I knew this was happening. I let it happen. And when it was over, when this person walked away, there was a person who was experiencing homelessness who walked up to me afterwards and said, "Well, are you going to give me money? Because that guy doesn't need it. I need it." I continue to think about that day and how I behaved and what was happening to me internally and externally all at the same time. And I regretted my actions.
Regret and that feeling of shame. Oh, it's so powerful. I have felt it. Thanks for bringing that up. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Daniel Pink to the Money Tales podcast.
Hey, thanks, Cammie. Glad to be with you guys. Interesting to hear your money regrets.
Daniel, would you briefly introduce yourself and share a couple pivotal moments that really influenced who you are today?
I'm a writer. I'm based in Washington, D.C. Over the last 20 years, I've written 7 books on a whole range of different topics, from the science of motivation to the science of timing to sales and persuasion to a graphic novel of career advice, a bunch of other projects over the years as well. And 2 pivotal moments occurred for me between 25 and 30 years ago. One was when I quit a job and decided to work for myself. That was a pivotal moment. And then 2 years before that, I married my wife. And then shortly after getting married, we had a kid. So in the space of like maybe 3 or 4 years, there were 3 major inflection points.
Tell us a little bit about growing up and specifically around money and when money started having meaning to you. Do you know when it is? Where'd you grow up and how did you learn about money?
I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, actually. My parents never made very much money, and that was actually very prominent conversation throughout the household. So I grew up very much in a scarcity mentality about money. I don't want to paint this too dire. It wasn't like I didn't have a place to live, I didn't have food to eat, didn't have clothes on my back, wasn't anywhere close to that.
That scarcity mindset comes up a lot on Money Tales, and I'm curious, did you carry that forward as you were coming into your own?
Absolutely. I've had difficulty shedding it to this day when I'm much more in a position of abundance than I am in scarcity.
It's really hard.
Abundance is a second language. I still speak it with an accent. Scarcity is my native language.
So I'm curious, Daniel, and thank you for sharing that. How does that manifest in your day-to-day as you're making decisions about money?
I think it manifests itself in probably being more concerned about risk and security than someone looking from the outside would say I needed to be. I'm not sure whether this traces exactly to the scarcity mentality, but it might be related to it in some way. I really don't like spending money. I want to divide that don't like into 2 different categories. One of them is sometimes I find it painful to spend money. I don't love buying stuff. The idea that people would shop for pleasure is such an alien concept to me. I don't understand it at all. I get almost no personal satisfaction from buying anything. Both of those things end up being very good for your financial future in that I really don't waste money.
What brings you joy?
What brings me joy is doing work that matters, creating stuff, learning stuff, figuring stuff out, putting stuff out in the world, and my relationships with other people, particularly the people who I love, but even the people who I love in my immediate circle, but even other people who I have relationships with and who I spend time with. Those are the things that give me joy.
This is making me wonder about that time 25 years ago as a person who was recently married and working and deciding that what you were doing wasn't working for you anymore and you wanted to start your own thing. Tell us more about that. What was happening? Because when folks have a scarcity mindset and they're not caught up with money, they don't always choose the entrepreneurial route.
I think that I managed to square that circle, and I'll tell you how, in a hyper-rational way. I was working at a job. I was a political speechwriter. This is my early 30s. I decided that I did not want to work in politics the rest of my life. In fact, I wanted to stop working in politics. This was not my future. And I discovered somewhat later than many people that what I really wanted to do was be a writer of my own stuff. being a speechwriter and being a writer that I am now are very different things, largely because when you're writing your own stuff, you have your name on it. It's your ideas. You figure it out. There's much more about you in there. And I realized I didn't want to do that. And I wanted to write my own stuff. And I said, the only way I'm going to do that is by going out on my own. And if I ask myself the question, is this risky? The answer is yes, no question about it. But I wasn't making that much money in the first place. And the second thing is I thought it was actually riskier, both existentially and financially, to continue doing something that I didn't want to do. I actually thought very rationally about that. That's one facet of it. The second facet of it was when I went out on my own, my wife and I mapped it out. And she didn't quit her job. She still had a job. She was a lawyer at the Justice Department. She didn't give up her health insurance. And we said, let's try this for 2 years and see where we are. And the worst case scenario was that I could go back and get a job. I mean, I had enough skills that I could go back and get a job. We really thought about this super rationally about compared to what worst case scenarios and mitigating other kinds of risks. The risk of we're not going to go from 2 incomes to 0 incomes. We're going to go from 2 incomes to 1 income. The other thing about it, and this is where my frugality comes in, is that I didn't say, oh, I need to go rent an office now. It's like, no, I'm going to go do this in our attic. We're not going to make a big investment. We're going to keep our overhead low because we don't know whether this is going to work. We're not going to go crazy buying stuff or renting things or anything like that. And actually, to this day, I've been doing this for a very long time now. I've been doing this for 26 years. I have never had an office outside of my home. I have never paid rent to anybody else. All which is to say is that I do think that it's possible to square the desire to be entrepreneurial and go out on your own with frugality, sound financial judgment.
So you're willing to take the risk as long as you had other knowable risks covered.
Exactly. I think that there is a difference between scarcity and tolerance for risk. I think that there might be some overlap, but I think that they are different things. And so I had a scarcity mindset. There's no question about it. But I didn't have that much of a risk-averse mindset. And I think in some ways those are related because I didn't have a lot to lose. It wasn't like I was sitting on something. I wasn't putting massive capital at risk. I didn't really have a lot to lose. The other thing is I was rational enough to always ask the compared to what question. If you contemplate a path and that path is tumultuous, that path is risky, that path is uncertain, that's not enough. You also have to ask yourself compared to what? And the compared to what was being miserable for many years, compared to what was I was working in politics. That's precarious in and of itself. The entire labor market is precarious. You could have a job and get fired the next day. If you approach this rationally, which is basically saying, how risky is this really compared to what? And then if you're going to do this thing, let's do it in a way, as Sandy, as you're saying, where you can mitigate, push down the knowable risks. And the knowable risks were the income stream in our household. The knowable risks was the outlays that I was making as a modest little mini entrepreneur writer.
Compared to what is such an important question. I think that is an overlay that a lot of us should be asking ourselves compared to us. And it's a great way to think about risk.
I do think that at some point, maybe not explicitly, but instinctually, I realized that this idea of financial well-being, the idea that there was a false trade-off that some people were making. They were saying, I can either have some financial security or I can do what I really want to do. And I never bought that as an inherent trade-off. In fact, my suspicion for a long time was that if you actually do stuff you want to do and work your ass off and do it well, that you're generally going to be fine. And that presuming the trade-off was holding people back. Now, I couldn't say that as clearly as I'm saying it to you now, but I do think, looking back on my younger self, that I had a gut sense of that. And that helped me make that move.
Yeah, it sounds like you're going for the both and for sure.
And what's interesting about the both and, Sandy, is that that is the opposite of a scarcity mentality. So you can have a scarcity mentality when it comes to money. Having a scarcity mindset and risk tolerance are not exactly the same thing. And it's possible, I think, as someone like me, to have a scarcity mindset about money, but also not be too wigged out by risk.
Not clinging to the rock. That's interesting. Dan, I actually met you I think back in 2009, not in person, but through your book, A Whole New Mind. I love it. So I'm a marketer. I love thinking about brand and all that. And in this book, you talked about right brain thinking and why people have to be more right brain oriented to succeed. When you were building out this book, how do you think money plays into this right brain thinking? A lot of professionals think, no, it needs to be really adds up. We do a spreadsheet. The right brain thinking doesn't drive results. Can you share a little bit about your thoughts on that?
I think you have to go back to the title, Cami, and the title is A Whole New Mind. And I think it's the case of money. And what you have to be, in some ways, my story reflects that. It is sort of a right brain move to say, I'm actually going to be more fulfilled writing my own stuff under my own byline, writing what I want to write about, because I have my own ideas. And I think they're better than other people's ideas. And I think I can do it better than other people. That's kind of a crazy woo-woo thing to think. That's the right brain side of it. The left brain side of it is, let's sit around the dining room table and figure out exactly how much money we need, how much money is going to go out, how long we can sustain this for, and how we can eliminate any unnecessary expense. So that's the left brain. And so any kind of fine arts, whether it's music, theater, visual arts, those kinds of capabilities, not necessarily that profession per se, but those kinds of capabilities are going to be more valuable. And I talked about the value of an MFA. Not surprisingly, I got invited to a lot of art and design colleges. And one of the first things that I said to them, when I talk to like young students in any of the arts, you are not allowed to run out of the room if the professor puts a number on the board. In fact, you are to stay there and pay careful attention to it. You need to know the basic mechanics of a spreadsheet. You need to know about compounding interest and understand that. You need to know the basics of accounting. The idea that your skills are valuable doesn't mean these other things are dispensable. No, whole new mind. And I would say the same thing with the people who are, say, majoring in accounting. The idea that you think that knowing the mechanics of accounting is going to guarantee you success later in your life. No, you have to be able to think laterally like an artist. You have to be able to think symphonically like an artist. You have to understand composition like an artist. You have to be empathetic like a caregiver. And so whole is the key point here.
When you were deciding 25 years ago to start your own writing career, you and your wife gave you a 2-year runway to make that happen. And I'm just curious, it's some pressure.
Well, it wasn't necessarily a runway. It was like, let's do it for 2 years and see where we are. It wasn't like you have 2 years, and if it doesn't work, you're going back to work. It wasn't that.
So there's no stress there.
Well, there's totally stress there because it would be 2 years with roughly half the income we were getting before. Could I be able to make that up? We had a kid at the time. We were contemplating having another kid. There's a certain feeling of a ticking clock. Certainly when you're a father in his early 30s and you have a kid and you're like, hey, you know what, guys, I'm not self-actualizing fast enough. I think I want to grow up and be a writer. You go do that for a few years and it ends up being this frivolous thing. And suddenly you have multiple kids in the house and you have no saving. Yeah, there's pressure there, man.
But there wasn't a deadline. It was a check-in and see how it goes.
I'll see your metaphor of a runway and give you a more benevolent explanation of that. I think what we decided was it needs breathing room, that a deadline might actually work against it. That if you say you have only X amount of time to figure this out, that is probably not optimal. The idea was give it 2 years and let's see where we are. Giving it 1 year, we didn't think that was going to be enough. Saying, let's see where we are in 10 years, that was foolish. Doing a check-in about where we were in 2 years, that seemed reasonable.
I'm curious, as you became successful in your writing career, there's a lot of money implications of that. Hear about book deals and advances, and you're doing this for the first time. How are you negotiating on behalf of you and your efforts? Did you have counsel?
Yes. It's very difficult. It's almost impossible to sell a book, certainly a nonfiction book of the kind that I write, without a literary agent. And so one of the first things that I did when I decided that I wanted to write a book is that I sent out material queries and a draft of a book proposal to multiple agents to see who, if any of them, wanted to represent me. Some did, some didn't. And I talked to the handful that did want to represent me. And I knew enough there. I had done enough due diligence with other authors who had all told me that your relationship with your literary agent is a very important relationship. And so I took that decision quite seriously as a money decision, in part, just as a broader professional and personal decision. And that was a smart decision because I've had the same literary agent for 25 years.
You were talking about aligning your purpose with what you do, which ties really nicely into your most recent book. Sandy and I had the pleasure of hearing you talk about it, and I'm listening to you read it on Audible. And it's called The Power of Regrets. And in there's a lot of financial regrets that people talk about. I find it interesting. It's some regret doing and some regret not doing. So then it makes me think about the tapestry of life. Do we get to just pull on one thread, and what would impact in other areas? I'm wondering, as you were talking and doing your research on the power of regrets, what came up for you as you heard about people talking about their financial regrets?
It took me a while to figure that out. I looked at about 60, 70 years of academic research on this emotion of regret in things like cognitive science and neuroscience and psychology and even economics. I did a quantitative survey, a large public opinion survey about American attitudes on regret. And then I also collected regrets from around the world. We have a database of 26,000 regrets. And one of the things is that in the initial way that I categorize these regrets, I categorize them by the domain of life. So this is a career regret. This is a financial regret. This is a romantic regret. This is a family regret. This is a health regret. And what I realized when categorizing them that way didn't give me the insights that I wanted. There was something off about that there wasn't any clarity in what people regretted. And what I realized in looking at the qualitative regrets is that there was something deeper going on, that beneath the layer of the domains of life, there were 4 key regrets. They involve finance, definitely, but in different ways. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. One of the regrets that people have is what I call the foundation regret. That's small decisions that people make early that accumulate to terrible consequences later on. Now, many of those are financial. The classic one is I spent too much and saved too little, and now I'm broke. Also in this category are certain kinds of health regrets, meaning that I didn't exercise or eat right for many years, and now I'm unhealthy.
You talked about the power of compounding.
It's all about compounding in any dimension of life and anything you do. Compounding can be your friend. Compounding can be your enemy. Make it your friend, ladies and gentlemen out there. Make it your friend in any domain of life. That's exercise, nutrition, studying, reading, investing, anything. So some of the financial regrets are foundation regrets. There's another area of regret that are related to financial regrets. Those have to do with like regrets of boldness, where people have a choice of either taking the safe path or taking a shot. And overwhelmingly, people regret not taking the shot. And a lot of that has to do with, we had a lot of regrets about starting businesses. I'm stuck in this dead-end job. What I really wanted to do was start a business, but I never got around to doing it because I was too scared to do it. That's a financial regret of sorts. But to me, it's different from that foundation regrets. But those were the two that touched on finance more than anything else. I wasn't conscientious enough and I wasn't bold enough. And I think that those two things actually, when we look at our lives, those things are perfectly compatible. You're more likely to be successful being bold if you're conscientious. The conscientiousness and boldness go together, and that we have this notion that they're inherently a trade-off, and I don't think that they are. I think that they work together really quite nicely. You want to build a solid foundation, and you want to have an opportunity to learn and grow.
So this makes me wonder, Dan, as someone who doesn't like to spend money and can become quite uncomfortable when it comes to spending money, based on what you've shared, I'm curious what you feel looking back on your life so far was your biggest, boldest money decision.
I do think my biggest, boldest money decision was giving up a salary and going out on my own. Retrospectively, I think of it as bold. At the time, I thought I need to do this. It's kind of scary. So let me figure out a way to do it in ways that make it less scary. I didn't think of it as, I'm going to be bold now. I didn't think about that in that way at all. But maybe retrospectively, I think about that. But beyond that, I don't think I've done anything especially financially bold.
Do you regret anything that you haven't done on the bold side of money?
I had a chance to invest in Airbnb right at the beginning, and I thought it was a stupid idea.
Darn it.
In the very early stages of this company, I thought it was the dumbest idea I'd ever heard. I liked the founders of the company. I thought they were cool. One guy had read A Whole New Mind and had reached out to me. He was a student at RISD, at Rhode Island School of Design. And I thought he was super smart and very talented. And he had this dumbass idea for a business that I thought was a joke. And to help raise money for it, he created these works of art that were cereal boxes. And he sold the limited edition cereal boxes for the 2008 presidential campaign. So he had these cereal boxes with real cereal in them. One was called Obama O's, one was called Captain McCain's. And he was selling those as limited edition art objects. And I thought they were cool. And I thought, hey, this guy's really smart. He's going to be a famous artist one day. So I'm going to get in early on that. But this business that he's starting is a freaking joke. No one is going to want to stay at someone else's house. That's a regret.
What does that regret do to you today?
It gives me a funny story to tell. I don't beat myself up too much about that. If I went back and evaluated it again today, I would have made the same decision based on what I knew at the time. I'm not too troubled by that. My kids got a reasonable amount of money, like a couple of $1,000s, not zero, but not massive amounts of money. I opened up a custodial account for them because of compounding. And I bought them Amazon stock. And then as that began to grow and they got a little bit more money, I said, you know what? It's too risky to have this all in one. So I basically sold the Amazon stock and put it into an index fund for them that they have today. But that Amazon has gone up 40,000%. $1,000 worth of Amazon stock in 1999. I don't even want to think about how much that's worth today.
Probably best not to do the math, but at least within the S&P 500, there's still a fair amount tucked in there.
There's a big delta between $1,000 in Amazon in 1999. And I think that's literally what it was. $1,000 in Amazon in 1999, because our second daughter was born in 1999. So I think that we opened them up at the same time. So think about it, $1,000 in Amazon in 1999, its growth today versus $1,000 in whatever the Schwab S&P 500 fund. That's nice growth there, but there's a big difference.
So Dan, with these children of yours, what are the money values you hope that they take with them into life? Because I think you taught them diversification, which I still say is great because no one talks about the potential investment that would have tanked. So you're teaching them the importance of diversification.
I do talk about, just as a general thinking principle, compounding interest, diversification, opportunity costs. I think those are really important, not necessarily for your financial well-being, but also just as a way to approach the world, as a way to think about yourself, as a way to make better decisions, as a way to analyze the world. Beyond that, I'm not convinced that kids listen to you. I think more likely they watch what you do. If they see that my wife and I are not especially extravagant and that we work super hard and that we're generous, I think that you might have a fighting chance of kids who have the values of being frugal, being generous, and being hardworking. I think the edicts and exhortations to do that probably have no effect.
Sounds like you guys are modeling relationships too. That's something that's really important to you. Do you guys talk about money as a family?
A little bit. I mean, I try to be reasonably transparent about money, reasonably, not fully, with our kids who are not kids anymore. They're in their 20s. We did something else for years around that dining room table. My wife and I were finally doing well enough that we could begin being more charitable. We had this thing where we would sit around the table and say, we are able to give away X this year, and we are contemplating giving them to the following charities. So what we did is we narrowed the range of charitable choices and explained to them what these things do. So here's a charity that delivers food to the homebound in Washington, D.C., in our neighborhood. Here is a soup kitchen, or here's a food pantry in Washington, D.C. Here is a place that provides mosquito nets to battle malaria in West Africa. Here is a place that gives small grants to female entrepreneurs, and just explain to them what they were. And then we said, you can pick as many or as few and think about how you want to allocate the money. I think we just basically took the average of each of them so that they had a say in where that charitable money went. It's the family's money. It was partly helping them think through what are some of the problems in the world. Can you make a tiny modest effort to improve those kinds of conditions? And also, we have to make decisions with money, and they're trade-offs. So make the trade-off and see what you think and see what other people think.
Great exercise. I love that you shared that with us. This has been a very stimulating money conversation, Dan. Tell us, what's your next money conversation going to be, and who's it going to be with?
My wife and I have become fairly deliberate about charitable giving. We sat down together and said, what are our charitable priorities? We have sort of different categories of things that matter to us. One of them is saving lives. One of them is helping our community, meaning DC, where we live. Another one is defending democracy, which is imperiled here. And we think about those buckets of charitable categories and think about where we want to give within those categories. So I'm literally going to have the conversation about that with my wife at some point. It could even be this evening.
It's really great to hear your voice and see you lighting up around this topic, especially as someone who doesn't like to spend money. Giving money away does seem to be joyful for you.
I think it's important. I think that it's purposeful. The older you get, the more you realize how fortunate I am and how my status in life is the product of incredible good fortune. I was born in the United States in the 20th century. My parents had a college education. I was able to have a college education. I haven't had any health problems. You win, man. And so when you think about that, I think that giving to others who don't have those kinds of things or doing something to help fix the problems of the world is just the right thing to do. To me, it seems like hygienic. So it's purposeful.
It was beautiful. Would you share with our listeners, where's the best place for them to find you?
DanielPink.com, DanielPink.com. I've got a newsletter. I've got all kinds of stuff.
Dan, thanks for bringing your whole new mind and power of regrets and all this thinking and ideas to us. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you on Money Tales.
Thanks for having me, you guys. I really enjoyed the conversation. It made me think about things that I hadn't really reflected on. So that's a great service.
Thanks for listening to the Money Tales podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, share it with someone you think would benefit from listening. And leave us a review on your favorite podcasting platform. Your ratings and reviews help more people find our podcast. If you're inspired to gain clarity and peace of mind about financial matters, don't hesitate to reach out to our team at Asperient. Go to asperient.com/start a dialogue. Or you can email Sandy and me at podcasts@asperient.com. See you next time.